I don't think you recover or get over stuff. I think what happens is people learn how to live with things, because what they find is they find some measure of meaning in the loss or the trauma that they experienced that makes it a little bit easier to carry. There's another phase of the grieving process that people don't talk about, and that phase is meaning. Is what am I supposed to do with this now? What do I do with this cross that I have to bear?
Okay, before we go any further this season, we want to pause and ground this conversation in something you'll hear us come back to again and again throughout this podcast, and that's post-traumatic growth, or PTG. Because while most people have heard of trauma, far fewer have heard that there can be something on the other side of it. Not just getting back to baseline, but actually growing in the aftermath of what you've been through. In this episode, we're going to break that down. What trauma really is, how it impacts us, and how PTG offers a different way of understanding struggle. Not as an ending to your story, but as a different way to reshape it. Let's get to it.
You can do this job and be healthy in it.
People can actually grow as a result of their struggle.
This podcast shares real stories of transformation and explores what it means to live well through life's challenges.
Okay, we're back with the Struggle Well podcast. I'm Britt Myers here with Josh Goldberg. And Josh, I feel like an important thing for us to hit on early in this series is post-traumatic growth, because we're going to be talking this season with people who have gone through Boulder Crest programs, who have already an understanding of what it means to struggle well and post-traumatic growth, but some of our listeners might not. So I think it's probably a good place to jump in and just sort of give an overview of what does that really mean? How did that come about? I know there was an odyssey of sorts involved in finding your way to Boulder Crest and PTG. But let's just start with maybe what is trauma? Super easy question to answer, I'm sure.
So trauma in the traditional language and lexicon would come from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the DSM-5, I think now. And that would be defined as events that essentially are like threatening to your life or seem threatening, and sexual assault and things along those lines. And one of the interesting parts of post-traumatic growth, and we'll come back to this obviously, is how Rich and Lawrence came to understand what was traumatic for people in their lives. And it's really events and experiences that are like earthquakes to our belief system. Within every human being, we don't think about it, we don't consciously create it. We have a belief system that is our psychological architecture. And it helps us make sense of the world. And it speaks to what we believe about three things. What do we believe about ourselves? What do we believe about other people? And what do we believe about the world and our future in that world? And so, if I have, if you just think about the beliefs I have about myself, do I believe that I have some measure of control over my life's events? Do I believe I'm valuable, that I'm worthwhile? Or do I believe the opposite? Do I believe other people are good and trustworthy and worth connecting with, or the opposite? And do I believe that the world is a relatively fair place and that I have a positive future or not? And it's easy to see why when you go through a range of different things, and this is the part where there's a subjectivity to trauma that's not something that meets someone else's definition, is for some person, a divorce could be incredibly traumatic, right? It could really challenge their sense of self, their sense of future. It could cause them not to trust other people if there was betrayal involved. Transitioning out of the military can be traumatic for people because all of a sudden, who am I? I don't know who I am. I'm now AWOL and no one cares. And I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. So you start to get to this place where your belief system collapses. And the result of that is that symptoms, which have to be symptoms of something, are symptoms of a world that no longer feels safe, where you no longer feel how to navigate. That's where anxiety comes from. That's where depression comes from. You get stuck in this sense of sadness and grief and mourning that you don't ever get out of. And the anxiety is really the world's not safe. Based on your construct that you have, it doesn't make sense. And so the trauma definition in post-traumatic growth terms, I think, is a much more real world, reflects a much more real world understanding of what actually happens to people when they go through great difficulty. For some people, it's a series of things. For others, it's one thing. But those are the events that are like earthquakes. And the idea of post-traumatic growth is we get to rebuild. It's an opportunity. It's also a tremendous challenge.
Do you feel like it gets harder then once you've had an understanding of trauma, not to attach that definition to any bad thing that's happened to you?
I think it can sometimes help you see the connections between different things in your lives and these repeat patterns that tend to occur that we don't always pay attention to. But I think, I always say that, like, if you ask a psychiatrist, the definition of trauma is very limited. If you ask like a 12-year-old, then it's any time they didn't get their way. And I feel like PTG really comes into the middle because it is these earthquake events. And so it's not just the run-of-the-mill stuff or something that's disappointing or is unfortunate. It is these events that really bring us to our knees. They just come in lots of shapes and sizes. And I think, trying to say like, oh, it has to be on this list, it doesn't work. And you see this like in first responder land, they'll tend to have support when people go through something on this list of like 10 things. But like, what about the fact that they're dealing with, they're not seeing their kids because they're having a terrible custody battle? It's like that for people causes incredible struggle. Yeah. And so I think it opens up the possibility that people are allowed to struggle, right? That it's not a competition, I guess I would say.
I think I've heard you talk before about a good example of kind of counter to what I just said, which would be prisoners of war and like Charlie Plum or those that spent time at the Hanoi Hilton, and the statistics around their post-traumatic stress after an event that you would normally think, oh my gosh, that has to be 10 out of 10. They had 100%, but that wasn't the case.
Right. And, when if I can rewind a little bit in terms of like how we came to find post-traumatic growth, and to your point, for listeners who've never heard of it, welcome to the world of these PTGers, of which we too are definitely part of that world. But at Boulder Crest, we opened the first privately funded retreat center in the country for combat veterans and their families. We wanted to host families because life in the military, life when you get out of the military is hard. Life when you're someone you love is in the hospital is hard. We wanted to do that, and then we wanted to host other people's programs that dealt with a range of mental health challenges. We did that for 6 months. We weren't that impressed, and so we decided we were going to have to go on a mission to figure out if we had to build our own Boulder Crest program, what would it be based on? And, Ken would always say that his goal at Boulder Crest was to help people be as productive at home as they were on the battlefield. And in 2017, we opened up to serve a lot more first responders, which is post the Vegas shooting. But at the time, we were just focused on veterans and combat veterans. And we went around the country and we asked leading mental health professionals what works for people, especially people who've been to war, who are struggling mightily with a range of challenges to live a good life. And they said that nothing works to do that, but more importantly, that that's not the point of the system. The system is, let's do a diagnostic to figure out what your symptoms are and help you manage and mitigate the distress associated with those symptoms. So we will put a system in play and we will help you with talk therapy, medication to feel less bad, to better endure your suffering. But the reality is that means that your life was here and now it's here. And so if you're listening to this only, like imagine your life is like at an 8 and then you struggle and your life's at a 2 and we can get you to a 4. It's like, but that is a diminished life, definitionally. And so, and then we met Rich Tedeschi, and Rich started to describe the work of post-traumatic growth that we can get more into the detail of. Yeah. And it made so much sense to us. And the irony of our mutual friend, Jen Grady, likes to say that post-traumatic growth is the oldest idea you've never heard of. Because it really is the oldest idea on earth. And we can get into that too. And when we asked Rich, had he ever studied post-traumatic growth in the military community, he said that he had, and he had studied it with the prisoners of war from the Hanoi Hilton. And so you had 591 men who came home from between February to May of 1973, having spent between 2.5 months and almost 9 years in captivity in North Vietnam. And most of their time they spent at a place called the Wow Lo, or Fiery Furnace, which was a colonial French prison where they kept Vietnamese political prisoners before Vietnam kind of kicked the French out. And they were battered, isolated, tortured, and starved for long periods of time. And to your point, I think it's unimaginable to any human being to think about the idea that you could be kept in a foreign land, called a war criminal, so no Geneva Convention rights, little to no contact with anybody else, separated from all the people that you were meant to be, serving with and in the prison with, and then tortured at any period of time, eating, 2 bowls of rice a day if you're lucky, and all the other things that are happening in a place like that is really trying to break you. I mean, it is explicitly their mission to inflict as much fear as possible, and then to inflict as much shame as possible, because if they can make you feel fear and shame, you will then go on the radio and say bad things about the American military, and that was the propaganda battle. Yep. And so as these men are going to start to come home, they worried greatly that they were going to be in need of institutionalization, that they would be basically, that the North Vietnamese would have succeeded in destroying human beings.
Yeah, so damaged they couldn't recover.
Exactly. And so they did a brief and they said, hey, We know you're excited for your loved one to come home. And I still can't believe like the gall that someone would have. And this, this was based on World War II, Korean War POW. So it wasn't like they made it up. But I always think in my mind about Everett Alvarez Sr. and his wife. So their son Everett, shot down in 1964, first bombing run over North Vietnam, alone for 6 months as a POW, and then there for almost 9 years. And I imagine that you would have the gall to get Ev's parents into a room and say, hey, we know you're really excited to see your son, who you haven't seen in almost 9 years. And we know, and you know, that he's been tortured and lots of other bad things. And we know you're probably excited for like to reunite with him and see him. But the reality is we think he's going to be a ghost. And the specific words they use is they said infantile, infertile, and psychotic. Just imagine like hearing that. Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know why you got to tell people that. Like, if that's the case, just let them find out when they get home. Like, at least they can have the hope that like they're going to get to see this person that they knew. And to your point, these men start to come home. So they fly from Hanoi to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, and then from Clark to their home base. And they flew home in terms of date of shoot down and then level of entry. And they got interviewed by a psychiatrist in the Air Force named William Sledge. And he's asking them, like, how you doing, all the rest of it. And he doesn't believe them. He doesn't believe what they're telling him. Because he, too, believes that, okay, if you put people in a situation like that, they're going to come home and be very damaged. PTSD was not a diagnosis at the time. But certainly, like, struggle and lots of problems. Like, they had words for that. And he interviews them for a year. And at the end of it, he's like, okay, like, I believe you. And 80% of them said they were better off because they had spent time in the prison. And what they have found longitudinally in assessing these guys, every year they do a physical at a place called the Mitchell Center for POW Studies, compare them to aviators who were fought but didn't get shot down. And on every measure of life, their vision, their heart health, their divorce rate, you name it, they've lived happier and healthier and better lives than their counterparts who did not have the privilege of getting to spend time in the Hanoi Hilton. And of the 4% who have PTSD, it's mainly the people who spent the least amount of time in the prison, which is really like a callback to the Shawshank Redemption, which is this idea of pain plus time is where you are forged. And it was like the new guys had shame from getting shot down. They felt like they failed. And they almost didn't have time to benefit from the experience and the culture of what those men had built. And so it was this amazing kind of story and testament to life and to what's possible. But I think the other thing is, if we're honest, and we always ask people this in training, we say, okay, here's the story of these guys at the Hanoi Hilton. What percentage of them do you think came home with what we now call PTSD? And of course, the majority answer is 100%. Some people say 70, 80, but it's high. And I say, okay, well, that reflects our thinking, which is bad things equal like bad life. Like that's in our mind, that's our thought pattern. And they defy that. And they defy that in a way where they didn't have any like professional help. They just figured it out. And I think there's so much in that story that's so rich as a reminder of stuff. And certainly it wasn't that they got shot down and were like, oh, I got this, and like didn't suffer, right? And that's the other story we like to tell. It's either bad thing, bad life, or bad thing, amazing human being who transcends any sort of like normal human response and just figures it out, and magically like they just turn, lemons into lemonade. But that's not what happened. I mean, to a person, they would say about Stockdale, their senior officer, that what made him a compelling leader was that he never pretended to be unaffected by his circumstance, that he too suffered greatly, that he too felt like a failure. And he did the same thing he made everyone else do, which is really without knowing that he lived the phases of post-traumatic growth. And the long answer to a short question is that I think that's a big piece of the puzzle. Is so much of life is how we think about life. It's the perspective we put on things.
Yeah, and I want to go back to Dr. Tedeschi, because that was a big part of his work, but he also worked a lot with bereaved parents. And Claire and I on our team were talking earlier about, like, is there some trauma that really is almost impossible to get over? Because it's as a parent, I just couldn't even imagine that, as I'm sure there are other instances where, certain military members couldn't imagine somebody else being in a worse fight than them, or a first responder responding to a worse, like, vehicle accident. But I guess the question is, that isn't even the question Dr. Tedeschi was asking when he started doing his research, right? It was not, why is there trauma, or is there a certain scale of bad things happening? His was, what does it mean to be wise, right?
Right. And I think what I would say to that is, I don't think you recover or get over stuff. I think what happens is people learn how to live with things, because what they find is they find some measure of meaning in the loss or the trauma that they experienced that makes it a little bit easier to carry and brings it, and there's much more meaning to the experience versus it just being this awful thing that happened that ruined their life. And certainly there are plenty of examples of people who've lost children who their life stopped that day, right? And they never did anything to the bedroom, and they were never able to move forward, and relationships fractured. But the reality is that I think what you see time and again is, as this Gold Star mom I was with not that long ago talked about, that there's another phase of the grieving process that people don't talk about, and that phase is meaning. Is, what am I supposed to do with this now? What do I do with this cross that I have to bear? And, for Rich, he and Lawrence were tenured professors at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and they were unsatisfied with what they were studying. They were set, but they wanted to do something more meaningful and more interesting. And we will have the opportunity as part of Rich's podcast to talk more about this, but I used to have this idea that the two of them went to Enterprise rental car and rented a convertible and kind of Thelma and Louise except for the part where they go off the cliff.
Who wore the headscarf?
No, but they both had sweaters tied around their necks. That was my vision. But in truth, they got a motor pool car from UNC Charlotte's motor pool and drove to Atlanta, and the heat wouldn't turn off, and it was the middle of the summer, which is a similar version of the story. It's basically like them in a sauna, trying to figure out what did they want to know and study. And what they decided they wanted to know was, where did wisdom come from? What made certain people wise about how to navigate life? And what they ended up finding is what the Greeks already knew. And the Greeks had a saying that all great wisdom comes from suffering. And because it is suffering that brings you to your knees and forces you to grapple with the hardest realities that life can offer. And so in their journey, once they concluded that's what they wanted to do, when they got back, they sort of surveyed their network and were told to first go talk to a group of widows, which this is the 1980s in North Carolina, a southern state, where traditionally you had women serving the role of a homemaker and the man working and providing and generally handling the finances, and these men died at young ages. And so these women were left sort of without the skills they might need to navigate life. And so Rich and Lawrence would show up and say, hey, I'm curious, what have you learned from all of this? And they would say, nobody's ever asked me that. And the story that Rich tells of this one woman building a fence in her backyard, talking about what she learned is that she was capable of doing things that she never otherwise would have had to do. And then they went and started talking, because they worked with someone who become paralyzed. They talked to a bunch of adults who become paralyzed and heard amazing stories. I mean, to have someone who's paralyzed tell you that they would not undo the accident that caused their paralysis and that it saved their life or changed their life is an amazing thing. And then the third group they talked to were these parents. And Rich got asked to go to a support group of parents who lost their children, about 7 to 11 years old, to cancer, primarily cancer. And Rich's first inclination, which I think we could all understand, was that he did not want to go because he didn't know what to say.
Right.
And they said, that's a great instinct, because your job is to go and learn from them, not to go and try to change or fix them. And in so many respects, Rich is such a humble person, but he went to listen because the experts on that experience of what it means to lose your child and all that entails are the people who've been through that experience.
Yeah.
And he went to that group for 25 years. And what he heard was, unlike those other circumstances I told you about, is that there were no parents saying that they were grateful that this happened.
Right.
Every parent would tell you that their child was cheated out of a full life, and that they would surrender their life so their child could have had a full life. But they did not have that option. That was not on the table. And the only thing they could do was, accept the reality of what is. They say that pain is inevitable in life, suffering is a choice, and suffering is really when we seek to hold on to a world that's not available. And so the world where the child is alive is not available. Part of why people will sometimes never kind of try to find meaning or move forward with this loss is because they feel as though the place of grief is the place where they're most connected to their loved one.
Yeah.
And that is where they are alive in some way. And C.S. Lewis, this incredible writer, he talked about his beloved wife, and he said something to the effect of, the less I mourn her, the closer I am to her. And what he was saying is that when he connected to the essence of what his wife represented, then she was still alive, because that was vibrant, that was something that could not be extinguished, versus like a mortal body. And so in the process of all of that, they learn from these folks that in the face of tragedies that are, I think for many people, unspeakable or unimaginable, that what these folks figured out is that they had to do something with what they had experienced. They had to find and inject some meaning into it. And so, sadly, right, you see it with the Sandy Hook parents and the things they've done. You've seen it with the Parkland parents and the things they've done. And, one of our partners in Washington State, Leslie, lost her son to suicide, started a nonprofit because she can't bring Kyle back, but she can damn sure make sure that no other mom has to feel what she feels. And that's the next, maybe it's the right way to say it, the next best thing is to try to keep people from joining your lot. And so based on all of that, they decided, and one of their ideas to name PTG before it was PTG was Strens, which thankfully, we don't have a Strens podcast, so thankfully they didn't do that. But they named it Posttraumatic Growth in 1995, all that they had seen. And it was really this idea that in the aftermath of a traumatic event where people's belief system is shattered, like you cannot go through life the way you did before when you lost a child, or if you're paralyzed. Like life is no longer the same, and you acknowledge that. It's just no way around it. You have to rebuild and figure it out, and that's hard, and it's sad, and it's anxiety producing. And in the face of all that, the struggle you go through to try to make sense of life is where people find and rebuild those beliefs in a way that tends to be more realistic, but also hardier for all that might happen next.
What did Strens stand for?
I don't totally remember. I don't know. We'll have to dive into that with Rich.
Memorable.
It's memorable because it's terrible. No disrespect, Lawrence and Rich. We love you both dearly.
Yes, but PTG was the right call.
Yes.
Yeah. I did tell Rich that I had seen an example of that after he was talking about not just...
Sorry, of Strens?
No, sorry. Of people who said that this thing that happened to them that we otherwise would have labeled as like, well, that's the end for you. That was a horrible accident you had, and now you'll have a diminished life, as you said. But it was 60 Minutes, nerd alert, and it was a guy that had a brain tumor. Something happened to him, and he was a really renowned architect. And obviously he needed his sight to be able to do his job. And he ended up losing his vision because of this tumor, but he was alive. And he said, yes, he had this grieving period, but he also learned that when he lost that sense, his other senses were elevated, right? So like his hearing was much better. And he started went back into architecture and started designing spaces more inclusively. So like he worked with, I think it was San Francisco, a city in California, and they were redesigning their train stations and trying to make those more inclusive. And he could think about how to change the floor surface so that if you were tapping a cane and you couldn't read the signs, you could still get a sense of you were getting towards the train tracks, or they knew where you were going. And like even he said one of the first experiences he had after he lost his sight is he was feeling bad for himself, and he was walking home, and he said he was walking on the street and he went under an awning and then came out on the other side, and he heard the difference in how the sound had reverberated, and it just made him think, wait, I could design space like that so that people could figure out where to go even if they didn't have their sight. And it was just such a beautiful example of what you're talking about. But I think my question is, how did that work with Dr. Calhoun and Dr. Tedeschi translate over to what Boulder Crest was hoping to solve for with veterans, and kind of seeing these things and these approaches that weren't working at that point?
For us, so when we met Rich, because we were having conversations with all kinds of people, and it was very demoralizing and then I think infuriating at some point, because it's like, okay, so this stuff isn't meaningfully helpful to people. It's helping them manage their distress and endure suffering. But we have a massive suicide problem, right? So we can't look at that and think that the stakes aren't immense, because when people are basically told that it's a life sentence to a shitty life, then they don't tend to stay very long. So when Rich described it all, we're like, okay, this is the foundational philosophy of our programming. And so the question we asked Rich was, could we teach people who were struggling to experience post-traumatic growth in their lives. And what he said was that he had never tried that. He had studied post-traumatic growth kind of in the wild, if you will. He had done how they facilitate it in clinical fashion, which is pretty subtle, where like you might, one of the domains of post-traumatic growth is deeper relationships. You might talk about that in a therapy session. I might lean into that. But I'm certainly not going to tell you like, hey, Britt, everything I do is based on this idea. And we're not trying to get you to a place. And what we wanted to do was to be really, really explicit about like, hey, we get you're struggling and we get you see a lot of darkness and not a lot of hope, but we're here to tell you that there's another side of the story, and our job is to help you cross that Rubicon into that other side. And Rich said he was willing to give it a shot. And we started in May of 2014. We did this planning summit up at our lodge in Virginia and put together a course, and we ran 3 that year. And it was late nights, and Ken was very involved in this, and I was relaying the story of some of it, like where he'd be like, nope, that's not it, and really tear it down, build it back up, and then just got to this point where we're like, okay, we think we have it. We brought Rich in, and Brett Moore, who's another psychologist he works with, said, hey, we want you to sit through the whole week and see what this is about. And they both were blown away, and we did an evaluation on it, and that really is what kick-started it. But it was really understanding all of the facets of what PTG is so that we could try to understand how do you facilitate it actively in people's lives. And I think we've gone from that to Warrior Path now is being delivered by 11 teams around the country. Boulder Crest has now 4 sites, Arizona, Virginia, Texas, and then a new place in Wyoming. We have partners in 6 other states. We got 3 mobile teams, but that was the start. And then you're like, okay, part of the issue around mental health is just the paradigm. And the paradigm is bad things, bad life. Let's help you manage and mitigate the symptoms associated with the distress. And that's why you have people who feel like they went through something and then their life is forever diminished. And, human beings need hope. Like, it's the most important thing we can have in our lives. And when we don't have it, bad things happen. We don't take care of ourselves. We do self-destructive things because why bother doing anything else? It's not going to alter your circumstance, and it's easier to eat ho-hos than quinoa, and it's easier to drink another fifth of Jack than it is to go to the gym. And so but if both of those things result in the same outcome, why would you do the one that doesn't feel or taste as good or numbing or whatever it might be? And so that's really been our journey to deeply, deeply, deeply understand all things post-traumatic growth, and then I think to expand our vision to say like, okay, the problem's bigger, like we're just going to, meet the challenge and, spend every day trying to figure out how do we proliferate this idea is what I would say. And I think underneath that are not just explaining to people about post-traumatic growth, but also normalizing the fact that all human beings struggle. And I think that's a big part of it, because otherwise it's like, oh, this bad thing happened and you made, like I said, like you put lipstick on a pig and everything's fine, but it's not. There's grief, there's loss, there's sadness, there's all the kinds of things, and that's the messy part of life.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. Like you said, it doesn't seem, and Rich will say this, it's not a complex concept to understand. It seems very easy, but it is refreshing to hear it. And I've talked to so many people who've gone through Boulder Crest programs and who believe that that's true, that there can be good on the other side of bad. And I think one of the other cool things I'm excited to dive into, both with Dr. Tedeschi and post-traumatic growth and just the science of it, is also the vicarious PTG side, but the families too. And I think that's one of the things that I've heard from the individuals is how that trickle effect has impacted their spouse and their kids. And there's been so many who've said, beyond just it saved myself, but it saved my marriage, or even the really cool ones where they'll say, my daughter will come home from school now, and before she goes to bed, she tells me what she was grateful for. And it just really shows just the power of that message of hope and optimism. And I'm so glad you guys paused to ask the question of, like, can this be trained? And the answer is yes, and that it's working and helping so many people.
In our trainings, we have a quote from a lady named Mandy Pfeiffer, and Mandy lost her first responder fiance in 2015 in the ISIS-related shooting in San Bernardino, and she said that you have to know that post-traumatic growth exists in order for it to happen. And every room we go into, we say, hey, have you ever heard of PTSD? And everybody has heard of PTSD. I'm like, yeah, I don't know why we have PTSD Awareness Month. I mean, it's like we're all aware of it. And then you say, raise your hand if you heard of PTG. And I was in a room of very senior leaders in Homeland Security and Defense and First Responder Land, and 1 out of 28 had heard of it. And it's like, okay, so if Mandy's right, that's really a huge problem because everyone knows all the bad stuff, and then there's no scaffolding for the other side of the story. And so, the most joyous part of what we do is we get to spread hope. We get to be like, hey, like that's not all there is. Like that is not. The absurd part is if that was true, that bad things ruined your life, we would not exist as a species, because thousands of years ago, life was infinitely harder. Really awful things happened to people. Tigers stole people out of caves, right? And if people have PTSD then what happens? You don't hunt, you don't procreate, you don't leave, and then you just die, and like we're literally not here. So it's striking, I think, and we're communications people. It's striking that somehow the narrative in mental health is so at odds with the human narrative. And we were talking about like Landman. It's like, oh, where's PTG and Landman? I'm like, come on, like you watch the end of season 2. It's like you see it all over the place. It's like it's crazy because every great story and every great movie, except for French ones, is the story of someone going through great difficulty and finding wisdom in that great difficulty. That's what the Holy Grail is referencing. It's wisdom. It's not actually like a goblet. And so somehow we have this opposite story that is in sort of the most important domain of our lives, which is like our ability to live them. It's just it's insane is what it is. And so we get the opportunity to, I think, change people's perspectives. And, it's no different, like you talked about vicarious PTG, which is the idea that as you help other people grow, you grow yourself. And it's like, yeah, obviously, like, why else would people help people? Like, if helping people just damaged you, then at some point someone would be like, well, this is dumb. Like, we shouldn't do this. Let people figure it out on their own. But there's a reason why people go into all these professions. My dad's 78 years old. He's a physician. He loves what he does. He'll do it until it's not fun anymore. But it's super meaningful because he gets to help people and help people through their issues. So I look at that and I think, but you ask people, and you even look at the research. It's like 160 studies on secondary trauma, secondary burnout, all those kinds of things. And there's like 14 on anything good that could possibly happen out of helping people. Well, if you know what you study what you know, and you keep injecting into the world, you can certainly create a very upside down dynamic and perspective. And the last thing I'll say is we met with these healthcare people during COVID, and there was a lot of coverage there was some suicides for sure. There was a lot of coverage about PTSD, and in particular nurses and other folks in the hospital setting. And these people came and they said, hey, we want to do a study on post-traumatic growth amongst healthcare workers during COVID. And we're like, yeah, I'm happy to help, provide some technical guidance, et cetera. And then they came back, I don't know, a year or two later, and they're like, we have terrible news. And I said, what's your terrible news? And they said, they didn't grow. And I said, well, did anybody talk to them about post-traumatic growth? And he's like, well, no. I'm like, did you try in some way, shape, or form to foster a differential mindset than the one of all the negativity and hell they were going through? He's like, no. So why would you think they're going to grow? Like, we've literally beaten growth out of the narrative. Yeah. And in the absence of, it was like perfect evidence of everything we believe, which is if you don't tell people, it ain't going to happen. And so that's what we get to do. We get to sit in front of microphones and tell people, and write stories and spread that stuff. And that's why it's so important, I think, not to be like self-important, but why the podcast matters and why this stuff matters.
Yeah, and to double down on that, not to oversimplify the work Boulder Crest does, but I think just to amplify how important that message is, I was thinking of Andrew Dotis when you were talking about that, because he did a one-day struggle well, and he was involved in an officer-involved shooting. He was a police officer in Fargo, North Dakota, not North Carolina. I don't even know if there is a Fargo, North Carolina, but Fargo, North Dakota. And another officer was killed in that, along with the perpetrator. And he, spent 6 months recovering in the hospital. And he said that the one thing that he kept reaching for every day was his struggle well hat. And it just, for him, he had heard a message that resonated with him and an idea that resonated with him that he could find a way through this. And he still wears that hat. We actually sent him a new one because he said it was looking a little rough, crusty, a little tattered. Yeah. But it is a powerful message. And that's why I'm excited about doing this podcast too and continuing to share stories. And I know we're going to deep dive more separately with Dr. Tedeschi and some other leaders in that space on post-traumatic growth specifically. But I'm just really looking forward to spreading the good word about it.
And it's not to be morose, and that whole thing with Fargo, like I was trying to figure out how to get to North Dakota because it was the last state I'd never been to. This guy comes up to me at a conference. He's like, hey, how do we get you to come speak? And I'm like, are you from Fargo, North Dakota? He's like, yeah. I'm like, I'm there. I'm like, there. And he's like, what? I don't understand. I'm like, yep, just tell me when you want to be there. I'll be there. And so, just sort of like a frivolous intention. And then you go up and you do that. And then he sent us that message, and it really blew my mind when you just think about the reason why we went there. And I think the other piece is, and it's not meant to be morose, but like, you never know what life has to offer you. And there's this British pastor, Charles Caleb Colton, and he said that we have to have a way of making sense of the ills of life. And he said, through religion, through philosophy, or through indifference. Mm-hmm. And I think the reality is, when life is good, we don't think a lot about life. And when it's not, we really are forced to grapple with, like, oh my God, all this stuff is happening to me. And it makes sense why people get stuck in like a victim posture, because we haven't spent a lot of time crafting a philosophy about like, what do you think about life, and what do you think about difficulty and struggles? You don't think about it because we know bad things happen to good people. We just don't ever think it's going to happen to us until it does. And then when you're in the shit, it's very difficult to think clearly and articulate it. And so I feel like that's part of what we're seeking to do is, wherever you are in the journey, in deep struggle, someone around you is in deep struggle, or you're feeling good, it's like injecting this stuff into your mind is really useful, because at some point you will struggle with something, even in the course of a normal life, whether that's losing your job or losing your parents. Is like, it's just inevitable that you'll go through things that will be difficult, and no one totally knows what those are, how they'll affect you. But without being, like I said, dark, it's good to ponder this stuff, because it's part of the human condition.
Yeah, and I know we're just scratching the surface of it, but I just appreciate you kind of giving us a baseline, something that we can have as a jumping off point as we continue to dive into more of these stories of transformation and struggle and PTG. I particularly want to hear more about PTG and Landman. I think that's an interesting topic, mostly because I love Landman so much, and other movies like Titanic. I don't know how you feel about that. It's a lot of silence.
Have to watch it again, I guess.
Again. It's a pretty historical moment.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, we'll maybe table that one. Yeah. But either way, I'm excited to talk more about this with you, and just appreciate you diving in more with me.
Of course. And on our website, one of the things we sought to make bouldercrest.org is like a portal, or the home for all things PTG. And so there's a bunch of videos, stuff with me, which I consider more like layman, stuff with Dr. T, which certification, qualification, other ways that people can really dive deeply. Because like you said, I think the interesting part is it's not that complicated, but I think implementing it can be. And so when you think about like what PTG is, and there'll be deeper dives into it, it's like PTG is a process, and it's a set of outcomes. So there's a way how we grow, and there are places that we grow. And so understanding those things matters. And this is the other piece. When you think about like, where do we grow? Well, these areas of growth are essentially what I would call like eulogy attributes. Like this notion of new possibilities is being able to reinvent yourself, is going with life and leaning into it, finding deeper connections with other human beings. These are things we talk about when people are at the end of their lives. And you shared, in your podcast, you shared and talked about the idea of what your grandma shared with you. And when people are dying, they don't tend to talk a lot about what they did for a living. It's mainly around the relationships they formed and the things they navigated, which to me in so many respects is PTG provides this framework for, I think, thinking more appropriately, perhaps I would say, about our lives, more deeply about our lives, more wisely and more fully about our lives. And I think that's what it's all about. And so I'm excited to explore it on the Struggle Well podcast. I'm super excited for our PTG pod with the good doctor, who is just an amazing man, and getting to have those discussions. And I hope that people find great use out of them and some enjoyment out of them as well. And, I'm happy to receive a list of things to watch and learn, and whether it's Nicholas Sparks or Titanic.
Disney?
And then, well,
Always comes back.
I mean, I know you're a wannabe / closeted Disney adult, or maybe one in the making, but like the reality is every Disney movie is based on Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which is entirely one-for-one PTG.
Yeah.
Like, let's start of Up. What happens? The guy loses his wife, right? And then there's a little kid and trying to figure out why this man is so grumpy. Like, that ain't like a Mickey Mouse happiest place
Very
on earth start
movie.
to a movie. Exactly. But the point of the movie is that this is a journey that someone goes through, catalyzed by loss of their lifelong companion. Then he goes on this adventure. Like, that's literally every Disney movie. So Disney is like Exhibit A. You should be grateful to know.
I know. I'm like, how do you
for all
know it's
this
every
stuff.
Disney movie? Unless
I've
you've
only really
watched.
seen like, the only ones I remember are Up, and then I watched Moana with my niece, and that was great, right? Because it was this girl who like felt like there wasn't enough of her, and she was supposed to take over, but she didn't want to, and then she goes on this adventure and meets interesting people. Like all of this stuff tracks. I think there was a second one that I haven't seen.
Yeah.
Tracks this narrative that I'm saying is like this is literally the narrative of script writing and screenplays and books and movies, but like somehow you go to mental health, like Bad Thing, Bad Life, sorry, and that's not a good movie to watch.
No.
You know, like.
Did they make that movie? I don't want to watch that.
I told you, it's like French movies.
Oh. I do think it is a good point that people can reach out to us and let us know movies, books, other questions they have about PTG. I'm not the only one with questions about this, I don't think, but we'll have time to dive into them, whether that's with you or Dr. Tedeschi, but hopefully.
Yes, and you can bring all your, personal preferences and books and things, and we can dissect them through the lens of post-traumatic growth.
I think I'm learning to leave those out. It feels like
it's welcome most of the time.
Okay. Well,
except for the Browns, like there's no growth of the Cleveland Browns.
It's a good note to end on.
Yeah, Myles Garrett.
We need it more than anyone. Okay, I want to pause this for a second because I feel like I keep referencing things that some of the audience might not know about. I'm assuming that people tuning in for this have heard of Boulder Crest, they've heard of their programs, but then I also have to assume there's some who have not. So can you just give us a little overview of Boulder Crest programs, Warrior Path, Struggle Well, so we can all kind of build off of that?
Happily would do that. And so, Boulder Crest has been around since 2013. And at this point, we now have 4 campuses, our original in Virginia, a second one in Arizona, third one in Texas, and then in due course, one in Wyoming. And at Boulder Crest, we have a few kind of major programs. To start with, in Virginia and Arizona, we have our Family Rest and Reconnection program, and that really harkens back to the original story of Boulder Crest, as well as to, I think, Ken and Julia's founding principle, which is about just recognizing that military life is hard. Ken didn't have mental health struggles, but in 1989 had a parachute accident, and the first call back to Julia was that he was dead. Second call was he'll never walk again. 6 months later, he's back on active duty because he's Ken, but I think it was still hard because he was gone for 14 or 22 years, and it takes a toll. And so our Family Rest and Reconnection program is 2 to 7 nights where combat veterans and their families can stay once every 2 years at one of our places and just spend quality time doing as much or as little as they want to do. And that's sort of on the lower end. The second thing we do at our locations is called Warrior Path. And Warrior Path is a 90-day program, but it begins with 5 days on the ground as a really intensive initiation. That's a Monday to Friday program usually. And that's peer-to-peer, 8 to 10 combat veterans and first responders with a staff of combat veterans and first responders. And that is intensive, it's immersive, and it's transformative. And so like last year in 2025, we would have served 1,213 people. We'll serve about 1,500 people this year. It continues to grow. But that's for folks who are struggling, and you don't need a clinical diagnosis for it. But if how your life isn't how you want it to be, and you're struggling, and there's all ranges of what struggle means, is, you go onto the website, apply, and then within 72 hours, we'll reach out to you and we'll schedule an interview and have a conversation and make sure it's a good fit. And if it's not, or if you might need something else, you might need some brain injury support or substance abuse support, we'll make that happen and get you to the right people. And we also on site run once a year in Arizona, Virginia, military teen retreat, which is really focused on like you would have been back in the day, for kids whose parents are in the military, and it's challenging, and you move around a lot if in many instances. And then we do a couples program, which is for Warrior Path alum and their spouses, which we call Couples Path. That's on site. That's the programs we run. In addition to that, we started a program in 2021 called Struggle Well. And so Struggle Well is many things, which I think we talked about in the opening podcast of this series, and this season is, Struggle Well is a philosophy, Struggle Well is a book, and Struggle Well is a program. So, when we mention it, you got to figure out which one it is. But the program is really 2 and 5 day trainings that take place in military units and in first responder agencies around the country. We do some mild work with healthcare and out in the community. And the idea is in anywhere in the world, a classroom, a training room, a hotel room, conference room rather, not just a hotel room, is we talk about post-traumatic growth, and we facilitate a conversation and a training that's based on those ideas. And so when we talk about Andrew Dotis' story, Andrew would have experienced a 1 day. Usually the 1 days are just sort of an awareness session, but we did kind of a deeper dive up in Fargo. But that's really kind of the landscape of the programs. And the other piece for us is, in addition to these peer-delivered programs, which are all the ones I mentioned, Family R&R, Military Teen, Couples, Warrior Path, Struggle Well, is we have to make sure that, for the same reason why it's important that individuals who are struggling understand post-traumatic growth, that people who are guiding other people who are struggling, mental health professionals, chaplains, peers, et cetera, that those folks are also aware of it. Because the reality is that far too much of the time, people are not getting trained in anything on the other side of the ledger. And by people, I mean, if you're a normal mental health professional, go through a normal training program, the odds that you would learn about Rich Tedeschi are low. And that's an outrage, really, that we're not having that conversation. And so making sure we inject it into that world, and we have a couple online efforts. We have the Posttraumatic Growth certification for licensed mental health professionals, which comes with continuing education credits for social workers and mental health professionals. And then Posttraumatic Growth certification for healthcare education and support personnel, meaning people who are helping but don't necessarily have like an official credential or maybe licensure certificates that go through the state. And we also have a program called PTG for Life, which is yours truly, teaching about Struggle Well in a way that's sort of meant to be interactive with people who are going through the program. So as you can see, sort of a broad swath of activity that we're engaged in, all designed to inject PTG into the world, both into programs, but also into like ecosystems and cultures where folks who are struggling are going to encounter. And my hope and expectation for the future is, that the VA system is a place where PTG takes root. And it's very likely that the veterans being served in that system, and they serve something like 57,000 veterans a day in mental health. It's immense. And that the overwhelming majority of them get the opportunity to hear about post-traumatic growth from someone working at the VA. Maybe it's a peer, maybe it's a chaplain, maybe it's a mental health professional, maybe it's their anesthesiologist or their surgeon or their primary care doc or their whole health people, but that they're having that conversation. And if we do that, we'll be successful, I think, beyond our wildest imagination, because we'll make sure that the ledger's balanced, and that hope is a part of the equation.
Thanks, Josh. I'm glad we paused to do that, because I think we're going to be hearing those references a lot, especially through this podcast. And so people have a general idea of why they keep talking about Struggle Well and post-traumatic growth. And then we'll deep dive a little more on our other podcast with Dr. Tedeschi and you, where we kind of talk about the science of post-traumatic growth. Hopefully people tune in for both podcasts. But if you are interested in Struggle Well or Warrior Path or any of the Boulder Crest programs, Military Teen, Couples Path, you can learn more at bouldercrest.org.